Welcome, my friends, to a new episode of Frameworks. And in this episode, we're going to talk about another framework for teaching literature. In the previous episode, we talked about the IBA, which is the information-based approach. But in this episode, we're going to talk about the PRA, or the Personal Response Approach. And this is also another approach for teaching literature. So let's learn more about this approach and see how we can use it in teaching literature. So let's go. Now, a very important question. What do we focus on in this approach? In the information-based approach, we focus on information. But in this PRA approach, personal response approach, we focus on personal experience. What do we mean by focusing on personal experience? We try to link students' personal experience to the literary work. We try to get the students to make connections between their personal experiences and the literary text. So that's what we focus on, personal experiences. But what about the stages and rationales behind these stages in the PRA, the personal response approach? Let's see. And as usual, the stage one is leading. And leading, as we know, is to generate students' interest in the literary work. And again, in leading, in this approach, we try to personalize things. We try to make things more about a student's life. And then after leading, we have reading. And reading here, as usual, is an optional stage. Why? Because you can ask your students to read at home, and this is how you save more time in the lesson. Or you can get them to read in the lesson if you have enough time for that, of course. And the rationale behind reading is to give students the opportunity to read the literary work. Now, after reading, we have the personalization stage. And in the personalization stage, we will try to help students personalize the themes in the literary text, the topics in the literary text, the key issues in the literary text. That's what we want to do here. And after personalization, we have the responding stage. And in the responding stage, we get students to respond to different parts of the text. And then finally, we come to the speaking stage. And in this stage, we're going to get students to express their feelings about the issues in the text and to exchange their opinions about them. Right. So let's see how we can move these stages into actual implementation by giving you an example from the American literature, and to be specific, folk tales from the American literature. Let's see. And we have here a folk tale known as Coyote and the Buffalo, or as in American English, Coyote and the Buffalo, right? And this is by the writer Mourning Dove. Right, okay. And my friends, for that purpose, I'm going to use a wonderful book on American literature by McDougall Little, as you see here in the picture. I'm going to use that book as my source for teaching Coyote and the Buffalo. So let's talk about the background of this story, Coyote and the Buffalo. And it's one of many traditional stories featuring the animal people. Someone might ask, Shadi, what are the animal people? And I would say the animal people are magical creatures, supernatural beings, believed by the Okanogan to have been the first inhabitants of the world. The animal people had magical powers and could alter the shapes. When human beings appeared on the earth, the animal people would change into different animal species. Coyote, one of the most important animal people, is thought to have made the world habitable for humans by killing monsters and bringing fire and salmon. Okay, right? So that's the background of the story. Okay, good. Now, and as I said, I'm going in this session to use a book by McDougall Little. It's called American Literature. Now, let's start with the lead-in. And again, when I look at the wonderful book we have, we can find a section that would fit so much in the PRA, which is the personal response approach. Because as we said, it's about, this approach is about connecting the literary text to students' personal experiences. And look at this section, let's read it together. It says, why do we root for the bad guy? Or why do we support the bad guy? And then the key idea here, wherever they go, they ignore the rules. Those are the bad guys. They stir up trouble, and yet we admire and love them, despite or maybe because of their bad behavior. Many societies have famous villains or trickster figures who both infuriate and inspire the people around them. Now, that's a wonderful idea. So the idea here is why people love trickster characters, why people sometimes love villains. And this is an idea that we see a lot in so many different cultures. And one of them is the Egyptian cultures. We have so many movies about tricksters and villains, and people love them and cheer for them. And these movies are very common in Egypt, and we can use this for leading. So you can actually start as a teacher by talking about the idea of villain and asking this question to your students. Why do some people like villains and admire them? However, they're not very good people. And then the discussion starts, and then you can ask another question for the sake of more personalization, which would fit nicely in this approach. And you would say something like, can you think of some Egyptian movies where people actually loved villains and supported them? You know, and it goes like that. And again, I'm sure that this would generate a lot of discussions about movies like Ibrahim Labyad in Egypt and other characters, those criminals, tricksters in different movies, you know, drug dealers, but they're presented in the movies as heroes and all that stuff, and people root for them. Okay. So that would be a very nice leading, because you will try to connect, okay, this idea to your students' personal experience with Egyptian movies and all that stuff. Lovely. Then we move from leading to reading. And again, as we said, yes, we're going to give an opportunity for students to read, but when they read, they need to have a task to do as well. And I found this interesting prediction task here in this wonderful book, and it's ready to use for the sake of the reading stage. And it says, tricksters are often schemers or scoundrels. They don't usually act as other characters do. Using your background knowledge of this character's contradictory qualities, as well as text clues, can help you predict upcoming story events. As you read, use a chart like the one shown to record coyotes' key traits and usual behavior and unusual behavior. Pause occasionally to predict what will happen next. So students will be reading part, and then they stop and they write their expectations in one column of the chart. And then when they read and discover what happened, they write what actually happened and compare it with their predictions. Lovely activity, will keep the students busy and will give you also something to comment on as a teacher when you're giving feedback for the reading stage, like you're going to ask your students in the feedback stage. Of course, after you get them to work together, you're going to ask them questions like, so which of your predictions were actually right and which of your predictions were wrong? And that will develop also wonderful, wonderful discussions. Very good. And that would be your reading stage. Then we move from the reading stage to the personalization stage. And in the personalization stage, you can ask your students a simple question. Do you know someone who behaves like the coyote in the story? And give some time for your students to think about this. And try to find, someone in their family members, someone in their friends who would behave like the coyote, someone they heard of. And then they compare their answers together and they talk about those people. And then again, you give them feedback. Tell me about someone who actually acts like the coyote, and someone you know. And that would be, again, personalizing, the literary text. Connecting your students' personal experience with the characters in the text itself. After personalization, we move to the stage of responding. And in order to design a good responding stage, then you need to be well prepared as a teacher with wonderful questions. How can you do this? Read part of the text and then come up with a question that would require your students to respond to it. And let me give you an example here. Like, look at this part now. He came to a flat. There he found an old buffalo skull. It was the skull of Buffalo Bull. Coyote always had been afraid of Buffalo Bull. He remembered the many times Bull Buffalo had scared him. And he laughed upon seeing the old skull there on the flat. Now look at this question. So you may ask a question like, have you ever seen something that reminded you of an enemy? And how do you react when you see such things? Then students will try now to respond, to this part of this text, through this question. Like someone might say, oh yeah, when I go to this place, it reminds me of a bad situation that happened to me before. And how do you usually react to this? And the students, start responding to these questions. And you can actually give them a handout with the text. But this time it's not only the text, it's the text with some questions on the sides. And these questions are covering, different parts of the text. And the students, look at the text again and try to respond to these questions about the text. And that would be the responding stage. And they do that first, then they check with their partners, and then you give them feedback. Now, after that, you move to the speaking stage. And in the speaking stage, you try to encourage the students to express their feelings about the different issues in the text, the different themes in the text. So, for example, as long as we're talking about this story, the coyote and the buffalo. So question number one can be, have you ever heard of someone who destroyed his life out of greed? Explain. Have you ever met people who would use flattery to trick others? Explain. Now, look at this quote. I respect everybody. You don't have to earn my respect. You earn my disrespect. That's Charlie Murphy. And then a question can be, how far is this quote reflected in our folktale? Do you live by this principle? And then another question, how do you deal with those who break their promises? So again, this is an example of some questions that you can run as a speaking task at the very end of the PRA framework or the personal response framework. So again, my friends, in the PRA framework, we focus on personal experiences. And as I said in the very beginning, it's different from the IBA framework or the information-based framework where we focus on the content of the literary work. Now, this time we try to link that content to students' personal experiences. And we follow this framework, starting with a leading, and then we move to reading, which is an optional stage. And then after that, you go to personalization, and then you go after that to responding, and then finally to speaking. And again, this is how you design a lesson using the PRA framework for teaching literature. Thank you so much, ladies and gentlemen. I hope you enjoyed this episode of Framework, and till we meet again. Bye-bye.